Okay.
This meeting is being recorded.
And we're now live.
Great. We will let people filter in before we get started. Just a reminder to everyone to go on mute.
Hi, everybody. It's just going to be a few minutes until we get started. While we're just going to pause a few moments while everyone joins us. Looks like we've got some people filtering in already. Hey, Gary.
Okay, well, it's a few minutes past the hour. David, I'm going to say we should get started. People can filter in as they get off their last meeting and join us. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon or this morning, depending on your time zone. My name is Karina, and I'm a partner at Deloitte in the cannabis practice, and I'm also a member of the C45 board. So on behalf of the board, I'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar today. The C45 has had a good number of things happening this year, including opening a dialogue with Health Canada. We've been asked to provide advanced feedback on topics such as the recent changes to the KIR report. We've also engaged them on issues that we face in advance of the ministerial review. So this year is really important for our industry. Companies, are struggling to become profitable, and regulators are now actively gathering stakeholder feedback as we head into the ministerial review. So I do encourage you to get involved in the C45 with as much time as you can commit. You can join a committee and add your voice to the discussion. We do operate on a volunteer basis, and it's not lost on us that our volunteers are also some of the busiest professionals in the industry. So I also encourage you to tell a friend and help bolster the membership so that we have strength in numbers and lots of voices to influence what QAs need to foster a healthy compliance atmosphere in cannabis. So for today's event, we put together this members only event so that we can have discussions on topics that matter to the QA community in cannabis. The topic of what's happening with inspections is one I've been watching for the last couple of years as we went through COVID. In 2020, we did a series of QA roundtables and published a short report on risk in the industry. So I'm really excited to hear from our colleagues today that are in the trenches and experiencing the 2022 version of the Health Canada inspection. So thanks to the panelists in advance. As I mentioned, you guys are busy and you volunteered your time to provide insights to the QAP community. So I always think sharing is by far the best way to contribute to the industry. So now I'll pass it over to David Brown, the head of C45's regulatory committee.
Thanks, Karina. As Karina mentioned, my name is David Brown. I am the head of the regulatory committee at C45, and we have been working on feedback for Health Canada, especially focusing on the current review that is being undertaken of the Cannabis Act. And happy to say that some of the feedback that C45 has been providing to Health Canada in some of our recent meetings was part of the recent proposed regulatory changes that came out a couple weeks ago. And the Regs Committee will be meeting in the next couple weeks to start some discussions on what industry feedback might look like for those proposals. But as Karina mentioned, today we're going to be discussing what inspections look like in the cannabis industry today. I think this is a really important topic for the industry because we have a lot of new license holders who have been licensed only in the past few years during the COVID pandemic, when we've seen almost a complete shutdown of in-person inspections. And so Health Canada has moved primarily to virtual inspections and really has not been doing that many over the last few years. And so I think it's important that license holders are aware of what to expect when inspectors are actually arriving at their facility. There was a time in the industry when license holders could expect a team of inspectors once a month. And now we're seeing some license holders being inspected less than once a year. And in my own personal experience visiting some facilities in the last few years, I think that not being on your toes has maybe led some license holders to getting a little lax with some things that could cause issues when inspectors show up. And so we'll have a guided discussion today with our host, Adam, who will be talking to our 4 panelists who are QAs at different LPs, talking about their experience with these inspections and how that has changed over the last few years and what they're seeing. And so with that said, I will pass it over to Adam.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Karina. So my name is Adam Lai. I'm manager at Deloitte in the Risk Advisory Center for Cannabis Practice. So like Karina and David mentioned, we have an amazing panel to talk about, what Health Canada inspection looks like today. And our panelists will be here to provide, their insights and experience they've had over the past couple of years with Health Canada since the pandemic. How we're going to break down the session today, we have about 4 main topics, which really goes over inspections in general, what kind of changes we've seen, virtual versus in person, the inspection preparation that they can provide some insights and feedback on, and sampling inspection. But before we get started, I just wanted to quickly introduce our panelists today. So we have Sarah, QAP at Cicatrix Lab, microprocessor. We have Ashish, QAP from JWC, Standard Cultivation and Processor. We have Patrick from QAP from Emblem, Standard Cultivation and Processor, as well as Ben, QAP at Dynaleo, Standard Processor. So, before we get right into it, just quick overview on some past metrics from Health Canada on the inspection data. So, between 2018 to 2021, the stats have shown that, the main top 3 categories of cited observation has been related to GPP. So that can range anywhere from SOPs, QA, PCP, and sanitation issues. Documentation, retention, observation is kind of coming in the second, and then there's packaging and labeling observations. The rest of the citation really includes licensing, security, and reporting. And out of all those categories, the observations issued, 81% have been minor, 18% major, and 1% critical. So based on these types of overview numbers, it's really been no surprise that the industry was impacted by COVID, both to license holders and to Health Canada as well. And we've definitely heard difficulties and challenges with remote working conditions, which causes less on-site QA oversight and support. And from an inspection perspective, the shift from the on-site to remote inspection in the earlier days of the pandemic has definitely changed the landscape and the format, along with the time it takes to actually conduct the inspection and close it off based on the more back and forth communication and the transfer of data. It's really only, as David mentioned, like more recently, we've experienced more the hybrid approach with a mixture of on-site and remote documentation requests. So with that said, I just wanted to kick off the first question to the panel on how it's changed for them based on their experience with Health Canada recently. Maybe I'll kick it off to Patrick to start.
Sure. Thank you for the thorough introduction. It's a very interesting topic. And I think the first thing to consider is how the landscape has generally changed in terms of just the sheer volume of license holders would be the first factor to consider, but also how the complexity and just the processing activities that are actually happening and what is entering the cannabis market is increasing in complexity. And we're seeing that even more so now with more complex processes and products as well in terms of the formulation aspect. So naturally, Health Canada has to match both of those things where they have to increase the throughput of their enforcement mechanisms, where they need to create some greater logical definition of how this is actually going to happen. And that kind of ties back into one of the prior points where in the past we could see a license holder being inspected quite frequently versus now you could go without an inspection for a prolonged period of time, which ties into a greater logical definition because a risk rating could be assigned to a license holder. If you're in the low risk category, you're likely not going to be inspected on a very frequent basis. At the same time, they're increasing the sophistication of the actual mechanisms that they're using to perform enforcement of specific subsections of the cannabis regulations. So an example of that would be the differentiation between a regular inspection, which really is a full-scale we're going to look at everything you do in respect to adhering to the cannabis regulations, versus then we could get into a more granular definition, which could be a targeted or sampling inspection, which really is targeted towards some of these more novel products, which have much higher complexity, where it's also acting as a learning mechanism for Health Canada to actually understand how should products like this, in terms of complex formulations and complex processing steps at the same time, be compliant in terms of the regulations. If we do look at just the numbers, the volume of the inspections has gone up to match. So regular inspections went up by about 25%, targeted inspections, same thing, about 50% increase in terms of these. And that just goes to show that there's so much of these new complex products coming in that more inspections are happening, and there's greater differentiation in terms of how the inspections are actually targeting subsections of the cannabis regulations.
Yeah, that's a good point, Patrick, because I do notice, and I have heard from the industry now, Health Canada has kind of increased their inspections now, and a lot of the newer license holder that have actually missed their first year inspection, they're kind of addressing that backlog now. So we're definitely going to see that picking up as we move along. Kind of wanted to kind of bring forth the same question maybe to Ben, how it's changed maybe from your perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Adam, for the overview and introduction, and thanks, Patrick, for the great observations. From my perspective, looking at the 2019-2020 inspection data that was released, it's important to remember that that data went up until March 31st, 2020, which was very early on in the pandemic. And so it'll be really interesting to see how COVID is going to change that inspection data. I think not just license holders, but Health Canada themselves were very squeezed during the early days of the pandemic, and they were trying to figure out how to carry out the inspections on a risk basis while still meeting their goals to ensure that cannabis does not enter the illicit market and to protect consumers. And so I think that was a challenge for them, and the change in inspection frequency and inspection format was part of their solution to tackle that challenge. I think it'll be interesting to see how inspection data changes from 2020 to 2021, and then eventually to 2022, as license holders and Health Canada themselves are starting to move back to more frequent inspections. I don't hesitate to say that we're in a post-COVID era, but I think we're moving closer to that norm where Health Canada will, like Patrick and Adam said, play a bit of catch up on inspections that were missed previously, and then continue on with their cadence of regular inspections and targeted inspections. I think the number of inspections, types of inspections, as well as the types of observations that we're seeing in these inspection data will change and shift when you're in the COVID timeframes versus before and after. I think just because of the nature of virtual inspections, it is more challenging, I think, for inspectors to cite facility GPP violations. However, there's a more thorough documentation review, and so that might shift the types of observations that we see, as well as the proportion. I expect we might see fewer critical observations, but more major and minor, because there is a more thorough documentation review process, because they have that, with the virtual inspection, they have the ability to receive the documents electronically and spend more time with the documents doing their GPP and SOP review. So yeah, I think that's how we will see the landscape change when it comes to more of this data as it comes out over the coming years, and to see how the data changes from 2019 to through COVID, and then we'll see I think another change starting in 2022 once we eventually get that inspection data.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks for that. Yeah, so I mean, knowing the different types of changes that we're expecting and what we've seen, maybe we can go through the topic of walking through key components of the QMS, which Health Canada have focused on, based on your experience, from your previous inspections, and kind of want to go through that topic a little bit. Maybe Ashish, if you can provide some insight.
Yeah, thanks, Adam, for the introduction. And I think it's a very interesting topic and one of the crucial topic. So key components of QMS, which Health Canada obviously would like to go through, first is SOPs, like make sure all the SOPs are up to date. Then there's a master list of SOPs, which should have effective date, revision numbers, and it should also be up to date. Uh, then another key component I would say is batch records. So when we talk about batch records, it could differ a little bit from company to company, but at a minimum, it should include your cultivation, production, and batch release records. One other thing which Health Canada would like to see is your, and it's very crucial for them, is your sanitation records. Make sure your records are up to date on that side. Other records include pesticide, nutrient application, packaging and labeling, inventory and destruction records. And one of the key component, which I think they always would like to see, is your finished product release specification sheets. So that should be compliant to Schedule B of FDA of cannabis regulations, and making sure that whatever is written in FPRS, that's compliant to that regulations, and also followed as accordingly on the test results. The other thing I would say is your deviation and complaint reports. That's one of the very first thing which Health Canada requests during the inspection request. That should be thoroughly reviewed before providing to Health Canada. If there is some open deviation or complaint reports, make sure you have a rationale around it, or if an extension is required, then requesting an extension and being transparent about why those reports were not completed, so there are no surprises. And there are other components too, but I would like to focus also on PCP plan. So if you are a license holder for processing and you're producing extracts or edibles, then it is to be ensured that you have a written PCP plan in place. And a PCP plan itself is a very big component of a QMS. So a thorough research of your process should be done, which includes your process flow chart, your hazard analysis, and whatever PCP plan has been put in place, it should also be make sure that any information which is documented in the PCP plan is followed in day-to-day activities, because that is something is very important from Health Canada's perspective, since it is directly related to the safety of the product. So these are some of the key components I would say that Health Canada focuses on QMS. On a little bit minor or major side, I would say that make sure your preventive maintenance program is up to date. That's something could be easily overlooked uh, because it could also be managed by the operation department, but make sure that you have a site to it so it does not miss out. Otherwise, it's very easy to get an observation around it and at the same time to get away from that observation. Um, so yeah, these are the some key components I would say of the QMS which you should focus on, and then make sure that you can always also review the GPP guidance document provided by Health Canada, because it lists in very detail what are the components they would like to focus on.
Thank you, Ashish. Anybody else who has anything else to add that, or you see differently from Health Canada's focus based on your experience? Yeah,
Adam, I
that-
just wanted.
Yeah, go ahead, David.
Sorry, I just wanted to jump in to remind attendees that if they have any questions for the panelists, they can put them up in the chat or the QA function, and we'll be addressing those in a little bit.
Perfect. Thank you, David. Yeah, so before we go to the next topic, I know we have a special panelist here, Sarah, that can actually provide a lot of insight and feedback, because based on the license type that she has of the microprocessor, and knowing that she had her first sales amendment inspection, first inspection with the unique product type, maybe I can give her some time here to share her insights, feedback, some of her experience with Health Canada in terms of what stands out from a microprocessor inspection, and her product unique format that's different from the rest of the panelists here.
Perfect. So yeah, we had our first inspection as the inspection for our sales amendment, and then we were using suppositories, which was kind of a new product type for Health Canada. So it was definitely kind of a lot of firsts on both sides. It was interesting. So it was the edibles and extracts and topicals, and then with the microprocessor. We did a kind of a hybrid inspection. So we had to do kind of our documents beforehand that went to a specialized kind of quality assurance inspector, and then referred on to even more specialized because it was kind of a new product class at the time. So with that type of inspection, they really are focusing on basically batch records and then kind of spider webbing out from there to any of the other kind of QMS systems and documentation. So it was a fairly focused inspection in terms of the paperwork. And then we had a kind of a 2-day in-person inspection of the actual facility, which was then kind of tied in with the actual kind of batch records, as well as the standard kind of facility inspectors. So it was kind of 2 compliance officers, 2 full days. And really it was a focus on, like I said, the SOPs, making sure that everything that they had seen in terms of what we told them the products were going to be actually matched up with the physical products. And again, that batch record was very, very important, and kind of making sure that everything was kind of linked up, and from the batch record to the SOPs, supporting SOPs, like you said, those preventative maintenance plans, everything kind of tying back into the batch record, and then kind of back to the actual physical product. What we found was that, there's a lot of right answers. It's just really a matter of making sure that you are explaining why and really documenting that. So there was a large focus, probably because it is a unique product class, on kind of the justification and how you got to that answer. So, much as they know what the parameters are that they're looking for, they also want to make sure that you know why those parameters are correct, and to have kind of all of your references set up. So being able to go through and kind of link back to those original, like European pharmaceutical or pharmacopoeia or whatever that original kind of documentation is very important. And if it's not written down, it doesn't count. It has to be very, very well documented, even if you know you have the right answer.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks for that. And that's a good segue now to kind of go into the next topic about the virtual versus in-person inspection. Based on you guys' experience, how does the virtual inspection differ from a regular in-person inspection? I know you guys talked about sometimes you're expecting documentation to be prepared ahead of time, but aside from that, what kind of major differences have you guys seen so far?
Probably I would pass this one off to kind of Ben or Patrick, just because we've only done kind of the hybrid model. So I'm not as familiar with the full kind of full virtual or full in person.
Sure, I'll take a stab at it. Thanks, Sarah. For me, the fundamental difference between a virtual inspection and regular inspection is that there are no longer any surprise virtual inspections. Before COVID, targeted and annual inspections were mostly unscheduled. So Health Canada would arrive on site without notice, and you would commence a week-long or a 3 to 4 day long inspection with the inspectors. But after COVID, all virtual inspections are now scheduled by email to the responsible person on the license 5 to 10 business days before the start of the inspection. This gives the license holder additional time to prepare that they otherwise might not have had, which is definitely a benefit in some cases. The other difference is that the virtual inspections have a requirement to upload documentation, which can help the license holder with document retrieval. It gives you time to get everything in order before uploading to the inspectors, but it also gives the inspectors more time to thoroughly review and scrutinize your documentation. Finally, a fully virtual inspection gives limited ability for the inspectors to view your premises. So I think there were some technological challenges in the early days of COVID, where fully virtual inspections, they were doing a facility walkthrough via a cell phone camera, where the license holder was guiding the inspectors through the facility. And I don't think they were finding a lot of value from that. It was posing technological challenges, as well as just difficulty really identifying any areas where the license holder was maybe not compliant with GPP. They were unable to review any documentation, sanitation records that were present on the floor in that type of a virtual walkthrough. So I think that's why they've started to transition to the hybrid inspection approach with 3 to 5 day hybrid inspection with a 1 day on-site facility tour, and then on day 2, and then the rest of it is virtual document review.
Thank you, Ben. Patrick, any insights from your experience with?
Yeah, definitely. I can expand upon one thing, which I think Ben hit the nail on the head in this case, which is essentially the differentiation between a real-time feedback system versus a slightly delayed feedback system, where if it's an in-person inspection, the document request, the questions, everything that the inspectors are doing is more or less required in real time, where it can, to an extent, almost feel slightly intimidating, where you have a room with 3 inspectors and you just have to feed documents and answers via people into this room. So sometimes the flow can be a little bit disorganized for real-time inspections or in-person inspections. The very nice thing about the virtual inspections is it does essentially give you this very, not lax, but a relaxed, but yet still very well-defined approach that Health Canada is taking in terms of very sectioned flow of the actual way they're executing the verification of your QMS and the systems you're using to actually be in compliance with the cannabis regulations. For questions, you're going to be on some call with the inspectors, and you have a little bit more time to actually discuss as a group internally before you provide and give that answer back to the inspectors. So it gives you that little bit of extra time to actually think your answer through a bit more thoroughly. And especially for the documentation requests, these are fed back to the inspectors via CTLS. So this gives you even more time to thoroughly review and make sure that your submission back to them is exactly what they're looking for. With that one potential, you could call it a downside, but the fact that Health Canada now has technically more time to review your documents is definitely a good learning opportunity for the inspectors at the same time to further the policies that they're using to enforce in the first place. So I think the way that we're going in terms of a potential hybrid approach, which Ben mentioned, where the portion of the full virtual, which I don't think was working well either, which is running around with a phone and essentially pointing it at things, it wasn't working too well. And I think that both parties have recognized this. But the portion of the inspection that does work very well virtually is the documentation review and then a pre-scheduled discussion period between the 2 parties that are involved in the audit. It really does help drive forward a positive audit process, I think.
Thanks, Patrick. And Ashish, any chance you can weigh in as well? Maybe some of the pros and cons that you've seen as well.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I think Patrick and Ben has provided a very good insight about virtual versus in-person inspection. Overall, my perspective is that virtual inspection has much more pros than cons. The only con which I could see is like you would have to scan a lot of documents in a short period of time, and depending if someone has a small QA team, so a lot of those scanning and reviewing of the documents could be challenging. So I think one work way around could be is to learn how to actually evaluate like whether someone should be digitizing their records regardless of the inspection. So if digitizing of records is happening on a real-time basis, so it won't be as challenging to scan hundreds or 200 pages of documents at a time and send it to Health Canada. And at the same time, it is also to be knowing about is like during the inspection, Health Canada can also request documents, which they usually do depending how the inspection is going, which could also be time consuming. So it would be important in my view to delegate those responsibilities of scanning documents to someone in your QA team and save your time into review the final version of documents before being sent out to Health Canada. So that's the only challenging part which I have personally felt, like a scanning of documents, and sometimes the timelines could be a little tight during the inspection, not before that. So if you already have the scanned documents in place, then it's much helpful. The other one of the biggest advantage of virtual inspection, I think it saves time. It saves time for inspector. They're saving time in traveling. So ultimately that save of time passes on to the auditee. So in my view, that basically helps you in arranging the meetings. It helps you in arranging multiple meetings in a short period of time. It's also a sense of comfort, I think, as Patrick mentioned, is like when you have auditors every day on the site, it's obviously going to be less comforting than when you're meeting someone virtually. So it helps you focusing more on the documents. So overall, in my view, virtual inspection is going to be working way better. And if it keeps going this way compared to in-person inspections.
Thanks, Ashish. Now with that said, I'll turn it back to Sarah. You've had the hybrid approach. How would you think, based on the type of activity that you're doing, how would you fare in a virtual inspection? Do you think it could be easier for you to accommodate or harder, or what kind of challenges do you see?
I can definitely agree that the in-person is definitely more nerve-wracking, especially for a small team. I mean, the number of inspectors is almost the same as the number of employees, so it's very intense. I guess the advantage of having them on site is just that you do have that kind of opportunity to ask questions, and they really are focused just on you at that point. The inspectors don't have kind of other things, so it's a lot faster just to kind of actually get the ball rolling. On the other hand, it's a very disruptive process. Like when we were here, it basically shut down operations because the QA team is very focused on trying to accommodate the inspectors. Because we have such a specialized product, a lot of our documents are paper-based because we don't really have a good digital solution that's going to help us track. So it really was, a lot of just kind of running around trying to find the right stuff and make sure, that we kind of got everything very organized for them. So we definitely had some questions that we were not expecting and had to kind of go back and look for, kind of accessory documentation that was kind of outside of our facilities kind of usual documentation. Again, it's going back to that why. So original copies of pharmacopoeias and that sort of thing, just to kind of prove that our references were correct. So having, I think it's a speed versus, having that time to kind of do that, that research in the background and kind of make sure that you've got your documents kind of in order before you're sending them off. So the hybrid was kind of a good in between when it came to the documentation.
Thanks, Sarah. And you did mention, based on the size of the facility, the type of operation that you're doing, the license type, with that small team, how did your site prepare for this type of inspection?
So with that, we really made sure that our documentation was in order and readily available. So we went through our SOPs and just, first of all, for accuracy, make sure that what we're actually doing matches what's on the SOPs. And then also just making sure that there's consistency within the SOPs. So making sure that if you've updated, your core SOPs, that has actually been translated down to the supporting SOPs as well, and that everything kind of lines up, dotting all the I's, crossing all the T's. And then making sure that all your dates match and all your, your signatures are where they're supposed to be. Everything is kind of orderly and, completed. We made sure that we had kind of all of our documentation kind of pulled in advance, ready to go. Like I said, there were some of those kind of accessory things that we weren't expecting, but, having just everything there ready to go is definitely, it makes things so much easier. And I guess for the actual site, just making sure that everything is clean, organized, all of your tags are up to date, everything's initialed where it should be. And again, that your facility matches what your SOPs say. So if they say you're supposed to have a hand sanitizer there, check, make sure, is it actually in the right place? Is it labeled? Is it in date? Same thing with your tare weights. Do the tare weights on your products actually match what's in your documents, and everything is signed and dated the same? We did this kind of in a two-part approach. We really looked at kind of a spider web out from the core inspection point, which for us was, for the sales amendment, so those two batches. So going from batch record out to supporting SOPs and kind of down the line. And then we also just reviewed all of our change forms. So one challenge, especially with virtual, is that it does happen over time. So as you're going, the documents that you've sent to Health Canada may actually be changing in real time from the beginning of the inspection to the end. And the last thing you want to do is have either your quality assurance team or Health Canada confused. So we made sure that everybody was very aware of when those changes happened, what they were, and what the documentation was on the change form, just so that if there was something that we'd sent to Health Canada that was now different, everybody knew the reason why, and was very clearly able to show when and how that change happened and how it was all implemented.
Thanks, Sarah. And maybe I'll open up to Ashish, Patrick, and Ben too, just based on the standard license type. What are some of the key strategies that you guys have kind of developed over time based on the inspection preparation?
Sure, I can talk about that. Thanks, Adam. So one of the, I think, very first thing is to just read the email and take it in, just to be prepared about it. So yeah, kidding aside, basically what is made, first thing is to do is engage your key members from your organization. So when Health Canada requests for inspection, they're going to request a lot of documents, and many of those documents might require engagement from other team members from your facility. So for instance, head of security or the security head will provide organizational security plan if it's requested. An inventory team member will provide distribution records, shipping and distribution records, while maybe the production records could be provided by either the QA team or the operation manager. A compliance manager could provide CTLS data. So engage all the key members in your team from your facility and have a written plan with them, assign responsibilities with the strict deadlines so they know what documents they have to provide by what timeline, and keep some time for a final review on your end to make sure that documents are exactly what Health Canada has asked for. After that, at the same time uh, when this engagement or coordination is happening, do a thorough audit of your facility to make sure that the facility is in clean and sanitary condition. Everything is labeled. There are no big paint chip marks, and facilities preventive maintenance is working as intended, so that if and Health Canada has requested for a walkthrough, that the walkthrough can go as intended. And if there are any observations, give it to the operation department so they can work on it before the audit, or at least they have a plan around it. Apart from this, I think what is important is that make sure that the documents which are requested by Health Canada are reviewed in a timely basis and not just submitted as it is. So, and be prepared about if you have any deficiencies to have a proper rationale around it. So these are some of the key strategies I think which are important. And last thing I would say is always do a sound check, an IT check before the actual audit, because that would save you some time and some nervous jitters during the opening meeting.
Thanks, Ashish. Ben, anything to add on your end?
Yeah, thanks, Adam, and thanks, Ashish. In my opinion, inspection readiness has changed a little bit due to COVID, with no more unannounced inspections except in very high risk circumstances. Most license holders have the opportunity to prepare for an upcoming inspection. But in my opinion, that doesn't mean that license holders or QAPs should forego being inspection ready. I think the best way to have a positive inspection and therefore reduce the frequency of future inspections by being classified as a lower risk is to always be inspection ready, both in your facility and in your documentation. So that means closing deviations, CAPAs, customer complaints, signing all documentation and filing records and documents for easy retrieval. I think importantly, you also need to focus on preventative maintenance and sanitation records, because that is a frequent citing from inspections. So make sure that those records are up to date and filed for easy retrieval. And then the facility itself, now that I feel like countrywide they're moving to the hybrid approach with the on-site inspection, the facility itself needs to be well maintained, all chemicals labeled, all rooms properly designated for their purpose, as well as the secure storage areas being well organized, and destruction being performed in the appropriate area and performed in a timely manner. So all the aspects of a standard facility tour, including cleanliness, GPP, gowning, and PPE, those things are all important during an on-site inspection. And so always having those things up to date, even though we're not doing unannounced inspections right now, I think are key to having a successful inspection.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you. Patrick, anything to add from your end?
Yeah, I think Ben summarized it very well. And the specific point I would like to iterate on is the easiest way to have a inspection readiness initiative is to more or less just be inspection ready all the time. Being real time with high level, the two components of how you manage the quality of your product and how it goes through your processing steps would be QMS elements, making sure that these things are real time. So making sure that we actually follow our procedures. If we do something, that's what the procedure should actually be. Ties into personnel training. Verification of personnel training is very important. Key quality elements like deviations, CAPAs, change controls, and so on. If they're real time, it's so much easier to actually understand what are the challenges that we're facing in terms of our business as a license holder. One thing which is somewhat of a hot topic is PCPs. It is a much broader scope document where it basically pulls in numerous portions of the QMS as a whole and kind of ties it all together. So having PCPs for your extract products is absolutely crucial, and actually making sure that what is in the PCP is accurate, that these risk mitigation processes are actually functioning, which would be a verification of effectiveness tool like a self-inspection program. Then you have the aspects of operations and facility control, so making sure my processes function properly, ties into personnel training, high-level things like cannabis inventory, security of the facility, facility control like preventative maintenance, sanitation. All of these things are crucial, and it's so much easier if you're real time with it and are out on the floor and in the documentation at the same time. So both of these have to kind of be in harmony to function properly, I think.
Perfect. Thank you, Patrick. So, in talking about the evolution of Health Canada inspections, obviously, we also talked a little bit about the new type of inspections that Health Canada has introduced, which really is targeting around sampling. And I don't know that this kind of stemmed from, obviously, the development of new products, the 2.0 extract products, and really it's kind of a per product basis, right? It really allows Health Canada to monitor the quality of cannabis and ensure the compliance with the regs. So in addition, I know Ben earlier talked about how this is definitely a new avenue for Health Canada to learn about the new cannabis products that the industry is pushing out. So maybe if we can talk a little bit about what a sampling inspection is, like what it's about, maybe the purpose and the scope. Maybe Ben, if you can provide some insight to that.
Sure, thanks, Adam. Yeah, I think it's very important to talk about sampling inspections because I feel like not a lot of license holders have had a sampling inspection, depending on whether they are actively selling product to the market or they're just a cultivator or processor that doesn't have a sales amendment. I think that makes a difference in terms of whether they experience or encounter that type of inspection. So a sampling inspection is a type of targeted inspection where Health Canada requests a license holder to sample 1 to 2 lots of a specific class of cannabis. I think Health Canada has campaigns where they will sweep through all license holders that fall under a specific category. So for example, in 2020, they targeted all license holders selling vapes. In 2021, they targeted edibles. And so they're moving through different classes of cannabis and they're trying to understand the landscape of all the variety of products that fall under a class of cannabis and try to understand the risk to consumers and also check against their standards and potentially revise their standards as they get more data. If it's an in-person sampling inspection, Health Canada will be present as you sample product in front of them. So typically they'll want to sample shelf-ready product, so that's package samples, instead of bulk retention, because that's more representative of what is actually being sold to markets. So that can be challenging for vapes if they want to sample, let's say 100 gram of extract and you have half-gram vapes, that means they want 200 vapes they'll have to sample. They will sample bulk if packaged product is not available, but they do prefer it in its final form. It can also be performed virtually. So I had a virtual sampling inspection where Health Canada provides sampling forms, and then they'll watch you over camera feed as you sample, package, and label the products. So they want to ensure that you are sampling the lots that they requested, and then what they receive matches what they viewed over the camera. You then send the samples to their lab in Quebec for testing. The lab results will then be submitted back to the responsible person on the license via email in about 4 months. And any follow-up corrective actions will be provided if any of the test results are out of spec for contaminants like heavy metals or pesticides, or if there are any variances in the cannabinoid content versus how the product is being sold based on the NNCP that was submitted for that product or the product label. One thing that I want to add is while inspectors are on site for a sampling inspection, they also have the authority to cite any GPP violations that they see, which would go on to the inspection report, but that's not their primary focus.
Thank you, Ben. And maybe a question for Patrick and Ashish is, how does it look like for you guys when Health Canada executed it? And maybe if you can talk about the flow of inspection, does it differ from a regular inspection?
Yeah, I can take a stab at this one first. So from the sampling inspections, which I've been involved in, just to kind of tie in Ben's prior point, we have seen some iteration in terms of the sampling inspection itself, where the first one was actually a request to showcase the sampling procedure, so verification of how we sample via camera feed. But in the next one, actually, it was sufficient to just provide images of the product itself in terms of like a multi-angle shot. So it's interesting to see how the portions of the sampling inspection are changing over time. In terms of the actual inspection itself, a portion of it functions similar to a regular inspection, where you have a standard notification of an inspection, you have a target date. So this works very well in terms of preparation because now you know the date, you get your key stakeholders involved, and you ensure your preparation is up to par. Generally speaking, this will be prepared or paired with some pre-requests. So this will likely be items such as batch records for the products that they're targeting, because they are kind of going on a campaign on a per product type. So like edibles, vaporizer cartridges, and so on. Like that would be a PCP as an example as well, which is a very high priority item right now in terms of what is being verified as an effective control measure that a license holder is required to have. The further steps of the inspection would be comprised of an opening meeting. So this would be the definition of what is the purpose of this inspection, what is the scope, so what products are we targeting. So we'll go through a PowerPoint with Health Canada to kind of review some of these items and what are the portions that they're going to be targeting. In terms of how the actual sampling occurs, could do either way, where they actually want to watch you do the process, although I would expect that we're likely going to move away from that in terms of the value that it actually brings, where verification of the procedure of sampling will likely be a supplement to actually looking at a person doing the sampling process, where we would follow our internal procedure to sample from bulk, provide images of the product and the samples, and then ship them to Health Canada. At the same time, as Ben mentioned, they do have the authority to verify anything in relation to GPP while they're actually doing the inspection and reviewing of the documents that are provided, which ties into how the final results are submitted to us, with essentially being two parts of this inspection. First part being the monitoring report, which is basically the same as a regular inspection, although you should expect it to be much shorter because the scope of this audit is very targeted towards a specific product type and specific subsections of how that product goes through the processing life cycle. And then the second piece, which will take 3 to 4-ish months, which will essentially be a summary of here's the testing that we conducted, with the one additional thing that I want to add to the testing is that allergens are also verified during this, which is a portion of the PCP which is required. So it's important to understand that as a license holder, you're not necessarily testing your products for allergens, but you have to have a control mechanism for allergens. And Health Canada is going to verify via testing and review of the PCP that this is in fact functioning as it should.
Thank you, Patrick. Ashish, anything on your end that's different from Patrick and what Ben has mentioned?
Thanks, Adam. Well, I think Patrick and Ben has covered quite a bit on it and provided good insight. I would just add on a couple of points. Even on my experience with the sampling inspection, it was done, it has to be conducted by us, not by the auditor. So it was a virtual sampling inspection. And one thing to be is aware about that could also be a little bit time consuming depending what kind of retained sample one has been storing, whether it's a final product or whether it's a bulk product. And Health Canada has requested, in my prior experiences, about 100 gram of samples, I think similar to what Ben mentioned. And so just to be aware about that, this is the requirement, although it's not written in the regulations, but just to have enough sample for Health Canada if it's requested for a sampling inspection for anyone in near future. The other thing I would say is there was no video verification on our end. It was like they have provided us a presentation, and in the presentation there were sampling steps, and all the questions you can ask about the sampling during that presentation, like what kind of containers to use, whether you provide the containers. So they are there to provide you all the details in that presentation. And once that presentation is finished, the sampling conducted, and then we just take the pictures and then sent it to the Health Canada, which again could differ from maybe the auditor to auditor, or it could be also, I think in my view, could be a difference where the site is located. Someone might be located in Saskatchewan and auditors might want to do a virtual sampling than compared to somewhere where they could actually do a physical walkthrough and maybe conduct the sampling by themselves. But I'm not able to find exact scenarios that how it works, but just to be mindful about that. Um, Apart from that, I think all of the other things have already been covered by Patrick and Ben. So that's pretty much on my end.
Thanks, Ashish. Thanks for that. So, based on, what the group has talked about in terms of sampling inspection, Sarah, like, how do you think Health Canada would treat, your special, unique product type formats if you were to kind of run into a sampling inspection?
Yeah, with the unique product formats, it's really they're treating them with caution. It's really up to you to prove to them that your product is compliant, not up to them to kind of tell you how it needs to be compliant. So really for a sampling type inspection, having the documentation as to, how things are compliant, why they're compliant. If you've made a decision on a certain parameter, like a microbial count, knowing why that particular parameter was chosen, and then being able to show how it's consistently going to be maintained. So showing that, within your batch, between batches, those parameters are still going to be achieved, again, with the PCP, and then being able to kind of prove that through the sampling. The compliance officers don't necessarily have a huge background in some of these like kind of specialized products. So just having the links back to the original pharmacopoeia and just having it very organized is important. Again, there's kind of multiple correct answers, multiple correct ways to get there, as long as you kind of got the documentation to back it up.
Thank you, Sarah. So just looking at the time here, we are reaching the top of the hour. I just wanted to maybe have a closing question for everybody to answer, and for the group here. If you were to kind of provide one word of advice for someone's next inspection, what would it be? Maybe Sarah, you can start.
Sure. I mean, the main one is don't panic. They are there, for the same reasons you are, which is to promote compliance. Just try to be kind of helpful and be very organized and honest, and you'll get through it.
Very similar advice as Sarah. In my opinion, whether it's your first inspection or your fifth, I think it's important to remember that inspections are meant to highlight deficiencies and improve your processes. So don't see them as an obstacle to overcome, but rather an opportunity for improvement. As well, I think many Health Canada inspectors are learning along with us. So take it as an opportunity to educate them as well about your processes and products. And I think things will go very well if you form that sort of working relationship with the inspectors.
Yeah, for me, I would say be transparent, be polite, and just make sure any rationale you're providing to Health Canada, like it makes sense to you. If there are any deficiencies noted during the Health Canada inspection, that's a part of the whole audit process, as Ben mentioned. They are there to find observations, and you are there to correct those observations. But as long as you have a good rational explanation and you're working on something, they do take into consideration. So that would be my advice. Just follow that approach. Thank you.
Yeah, I would definitely echo the sentiment of just consider it as a learning opportunity, likely for both parties actually, where Health Canada is learning a lot through these audit processes as well, where we're seeing them change their audit process and they're devising mechanisms to actually audit specific things. So there's definitely a lot to learn, especially considering that the industry is changing almost on a daily basis, more or less. Consider it a collaborative process where everyone's kind of in it together. Both parties want to enforce compliance. It's just a tool that's being used to actually perform that process. So I think it's a good opportunity to actually perform process improvement.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for the panelists here for providing their time here to share their insights and feedback based on their experience. So really appreciate your time here, guys. David, if I can maybe just turn it back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. Everyone can hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah, really interesting discussion. I found this very valuable. So we've had a lot of questions in the chat, and there's been a lot of conversations and questions answered. But so some of these may be repeated, but I just want to go through some of the questions that have been asked. So the most recent one from Anthony asks, does it really make sense retesting all the parameters after sending flowers for pre-roll after the flower has been initially tested? Obviously, we need to test products in its final form for CBD. My concern is more contaminant testing except pesticides. So if anyone has any comments on that.
So I can take that. If I understand the question correctly, Anthony is asking, like, do you need to retest for contaminants in the pre-roll form if it's already tested in the flower form? Sorry, go ahead, David. Yeah, so basically, it really depends, I would say, from license holder to license holder. And the answer is yes, you could do that. Like if you have everything in the flower stage and after milling, your contaminants testing is done, but you have to justify to Health Canada that your processing of the milling and pre-roll preparation does not add any more contaminants from the flower stage. So at least for microbial testing, you would require that kind of testing because after milling, you have a good chance of adding contaminants through a microbial processing. While for heavy metals and also for your aflatoxin, there is less chance of adding those contaminants. But Health Canada has been a little bit on and off on this particular point. So I would say if you do go that approach, make sure that you have a proper rationale to justify to Health Canada, maybe through a validation study or something, that before and after there was no more added contaminants through your milling and pre-rolling process. Yeah, but microbial definitely I would recommend.
I think so Anthony just added that he understands microbial makes sense but feels HM and aflatoxin shouldn't be required. Anyone have any other comments on those?
I think a risk-based approach is really, as Ashish had mentioned, the ideal way to proceed in a circumstance such as this. You have justification and documented evidence that the processing step is not an introduction of that contaminant, then testing for that contaminant should not be required at that step. Versus if you do not have documentation over the course of a set amount of data points, then your risk mitigation is your testing in that case for those key metrics. It's up to the license holder to define what those specific metrics are. So I think microbial is probably the number one. And yeah, I think that's more or less it.
Yeah, the
Anyone else
thing to
wanna-
keep in mind, sorry, David, the thing to keep in mind also is like, because I noticed here, Anthony, you mentioned for pre-roll. So I think to my knowledge, there has been heavy metals cited in the different types of paper that could be used. So you definitely want to double check that before as part of your risk assessment to see if there's introduction to microbials, heavy metals, and aflatoxins before you kind of set that precedence. And at least if you get questioned by Health Canada, you definitely have data to back it up, right?
I agree with Adam. That's a great point. A lot of pre-roll paper manufacturers based in Indonesia and India are using rice and hemp. And if those crops have any lead or arsenic, that can find its way into papers. So I think having testing report for the papers from either the vendor or your own in-house testing can help justify not doing that testing in the final pre-roll form.
Okay, if no one has anything else to add, I'll move on to the next question from Marie Eve. And again, this has been answered by a couple panelists in the chat, but she asks, do they check staff training now?
I guess for us, they didn't, quiz any of the staff, but they did check that we had a documentation of the training, just specifically for the GPP training, and that all of the employees were on the list.
Yeah, for staff training, in my personal experience, I have seen that they look at the training it's not so critical than other components in my view. You definitely would have to do the staff training and make sure that everyone gets trained, but that doesn't mean you don't do the training. But it's not as critical as missing some components on the PCP or not having updated SOPs. So training records could be reviewed. But it's not super critical than like other components.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Training records, the extent of the verification, from my experience, would be in terms of system level. So do you have a robust system in terms of actually managing this process, making sure as new procedures come in or tie it into your change control system, where as you change things or make new things, people understand how to utilize these new or revised tools or systems, and making sure you have documentation that, yes, I have been trained on this revision of this SOP. The scrutiny in terms of the training records, the actual execution portion, I haven't seen to that extent. But basically managing those two things, I think, would satisfy that requirement.
So the next question, I believe, was from Gina and was about how inspections have changed or maybe are still varying in regard to geographical location. So I know in the early days there was different inspectors in different provinces, maybe adhering to different standards. I know that over time, Health Canada has sought to make those inspection processes a little more uniform. Is that what people are seeing on your end?
So Denalio is based in Edmonton, Alberta, and so we've seen a lot of the same inspectors that inspect our region. And I think Health Canada is trying to spread inspectors apart, but I still see a little bit of a separation in Western Canada and Eastern Canada in terms of which inspectors cover those license holders. So I haven't seen really any inspectors from Ontario come into the Alberta region. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but I think there's still kind of a segregation there. Especially with virtual inspections, I think there's more opportunity for different inspectors to inspect different regions because there's less travel involved. As well, I think the rollout of different types of inspections may vary from region to region just based on the capacity in terms of how many inspectors there are, as well as the number of license holders. So whether we do eventually transition back to unannounced surprise inspections, that may happen in the future, but it may not roll out uniformly across the country. It might happen in certain regions where they have that capacity and they're caught up on inspections versus other regions might take a little bit longer to return back to that normal.
So our next comment comes from Gary, who says he's noticed that Health Canada has reversed the order in which they perform their inspection steps. They used to start with a walkthrough followed by a document review, but now with these COVID inspections, virtual inspections because of COVID, that they've reversed that order. I'm curious if that reflects what all our panelists are seeing as well.
So I guess with our hybrid inspection, they actually went from documentation virtually to kind of a walkthrough of the facility, and then did the actual in-person verification that the physical documentation matched what we had sent them as kind of the last step. But it does seem to vary a bit from inspector to inspector.
Yeah, I would just add to that Sarah's comments. I do not think from my experience there is a recipe around it. I think it could depend on auditors' availability, like what fits best in their schedule, whether they have to travel for that or not. So they definitely would do a walkthrough, whether it's in person or virtual or both. But I don't think in my view there is a particular recipe, whether it's happening on the first day or the last day.
In my most recent inspection, which was June of 2021, there were 3 inspectors. 2 of them traveled to our site on day 2. The 3rd inspector based in Vancouver did not travel, so did not take part in the facility walkthrough. So day 2 was the walkthrough. Day 1 was the introductory meeting, and then after the walkthrough was completed, there was no on-site documentation verification at all. They left the facility and then proceeded with virtual for the rest of the inspection, which was an additional 2 days.
From my perspective, the last regular inspection was actually done via a image system where the facility walkthrough, the result of that was a series of images, and these were provided back to the inspectors. Although I do agree that I don't necessarily think that there's a specific formula in terms of we do this first and then we have to do this second. I think it really does depend on the availability of the inspectors and how that inspector team actually chooses to do the inspection.
So another question that I believe was discussed a little bit, but was posted in the chat, so I'll ask again from Marie Eve, is how do they validate PCP implementation?
Sure, I can take that. So PCP implementation is validated also through your batch records and SOPs. So as mentioned, like PCP is a bigger component. It's a very big component of your QMS. So whatever is mentioned in the PCP, for instance, if you haven't mentioned anything about your critical control points, how you're controlling those critical control points is by setting control limits, like whether it's temperature, humidity, etc. So when inspector is going to review those batch records, they are going to see, okay, this parameter, whether it's mentioned in your PCP and it's followable as such. Also, anything which you have mentioned in SOPs, which are applicable to PCPs, that should reflect in your PCP plan. So while reviewing your documentation, that's how Health Canada is going to see that whether your PCP plan is, first of all, applicable to the cannabis regulation. It covers all the components. And second, whether that PCP plan is followed based on your records and SOPs.
Yeah, ours was very similar. They looked originally at kind of the PCP and then linked that to the SOP. So if you say that you're supposed to have a cover on something, to prevent microbial contamination, they wanted to see that in the SOP you say that you're going to use that cover. And then they actually linked that into the physical inspection as well and said, okay, in your PCP you said, your mixer was going to have this certain parameter. They'll actually go and check to see, do you have that lid on your mixer, and just make sure that everything matches along your processes.
Sorry,
Yeah,
I would just like to go ahead,
sorry,
Patrick.
go ahead. Okay, I'll go ahead. Yeah, I definitely agree with the verification method. I've seen the same thing where the PCP itself is reviewed in detail, but the actual verification of the respective components of the PCP, it is very nicely sectioned off in terms of a cover page, a process flow, what are the portions of the product, what are the risk mitigation processes that we actually employ, system level, and then Health Canada would simply go through each of those respective things separately within the QMS to actually verify each of those components respectively. So it is a very systematic approach.
So another observation in the chat from Gary that I thought was interesting is he says qualification of vendors and labs are becoming a bigger issue with inspections. Is anyone else seeing that?
I can talk about this one a little bit. I definitely agree that the scrutiny of essentially the very start of your processing activities, where the vendor qualification is key in terms of material control as well as testing controls. Most license holders outsource their testing to a third party. Not that many license holders do internal testing via validating methods and doing it that way. So actually reviewing these records and making sure that you manage your vendors, not just approve them the first time, but actually manage them long term is very key in terms of actually protecting your processing steps. So it does tie into your QMS essentially as an input into the actual processing activity. So can definitely understand why they're enforcing it more. It's also important to consider that there are a lot of new license holders, but the different license holders sometimes could not necessarily start with a specific portion of the license. And what I mean by that is not every license holder is going to cultivate. So you could be sourcing your cultivated material to do extraction processes or further processing from a completely different license holder. So understanding and integrating their QMS essentially into your own is, I think, what the target is of kind of scrutinizing this to a greater extent.
Yeah, and I think also Health Canada is seeing more as the industry's developed and matured, that there's a lot more contract manufacturing happening, right? So depending on which stage a processor can intake a product, the form of that cannabis product might be already pre-processed or have some sort of processing step. So for Health Canada, they understand that there's different variations of processing, and that's why they kind of want to have that traceability and identify any sort of third-party supply chain risks.
And how often are you seeing requests for secondary testing of batch samples? Ben, I think you had talked about your experience with this.
Yeah, so I see that come up about once per year, where there is a request to sample a lot or 2 lots of product. I think it ties into what class of cannabis you currently are selling or providing to other license holders. So if you are producing extracts, and that's something that Health Canada is focusing on, then you will likely be asked to perform a secondary sampling of a lot that you've already tested and have retention of or are actively selling. And then any producers of edibles recently, I think in February 2021, in that time frame, plus or minus a few months, were doing that sampling as well. So I think they'll probably cycle back through to dried cannabis at a certain point, or maybe new product forms like what Sarah and her team are working on. So yeah, I think it's what I'm seeing is it's about once annually.
And anyone else? Has anyone else on the panel experienced those requests? Okay, sounds like they haven't. Well, I believe that's all of our questions that have been posted in the chat. Does any of our panelists or Adam have any final comments?
Just the one thing that I wanted to add just with the validation of the vendors is with the labs, they were very much stressing that it's up to the processor to make sure that the lab is doing things correctly, not the other way around. So they can ask you to validate the lab's methods and to understand the lab's methods in terms of, you know, what type of even extraction method that the lab is using in order to test potency, things like that. So having the validation for the lab itself, a copy of the license, and then also a copy of the validation documents for the specific base that you're using can save you some time.
That's an interesting point. So license holders need to be aware that they need to be the ones that are ensuring that the lab they're choosing is not going to cause any kind of product recall, essentially.
Yeah, and it's up to the processing license holder to define what the cutoffs are for any of the parameters, and to be able to tell them why that is.
One thing to add is a lot of labs previously, when oils was still a class of cannabis, had validated methods for oils. And then transitioning to extracts and concentrates, those validated methods are not necessarily applicable to concentrates. And so you have to ensure that you don't have outdated validated methods, but that you have validated methods from the lab that are applicable to your product form.
Yeah, just to add one more point and to resonate with Ben, some of the labs actually, I know they are still transitioning from oil to extracts, or trying to update their LIMS, Laboratory Information System. So it might be a good idea when you're qualifying your lab to have a talk with them, whether they have updated validation methods, or is there something on the report which is going to show which is not applicable anymore, whether it's going to show in the cannabis metrics dried cannabis when actually the product is extract. So these kind of minor things could be asked during your inspection and could save you some time during the inspection.
And I guess as one final question, this sort of a follow-up to the survey that C45 sent out a couple weeks ago at the request of Health Canada in regard to the COVID-19 flexibilities that have allowed for a lot of these virtual inspections, as well as other more kind of streamlined processes. What are all the panelists' thoughts on extending those or integrating those permanently into the inspection process?
Yeah, I think from our perspective, the hybrid model was definitely a lot more efficient than a full in-person. It's much less disruptive for everybody. I think and ultimately, it resulted in a better inspection. It was kind of more helpful on both sides. So we're hoping that's going to continue forward.
I would most definitely agree. I think all aspects or most aspects of the inspection are more suitable in terms of the virtual or hybrid approach. The only one thing that I do think is better in terms of in-person is the actual verification of the facility, which I think is much easier and effective to actually do in person, to get an actual feel of the culture of the facility. What is the personnel flow, to maybe verify gowning transitions, as well as material flows and what risks those could potentially pose. But in terms of everything else, the disruption to the operations, all of this I think is very well defined in the virtual flow.
Yes, so I agree with the hybrid approach too. I think all the points are covered, but just to add for the point, because when you have that in-person walkthrough, that also gives you the idea to know your auditor a little bit on a professional level, and you have the opportunity to ask some questions directly, and whether it's about your physical security measures or something like that, which might be difficult to ask during a virtual inspection. So I personally like the idea of hybrid approach.
I agree with the other panelists where the benefits of the hybrid inspection are definitely clear, and I think I would love that to become the permanent approach to inspections going forward. I think that also touching on some of the other flexibilities due to COVID that Health Canada has permitted to license holders, like the flexibility on packaged on date, witnessing destruction virtually, virtual or work from home QAP duties, and also giving more fast track security clearance to key individuals on the team. I think all of those have been very beneficial, and I would love those to become permanent as well.
Okay, well, I think that is all of our questions. So we have a few more minutes and I'll pass over to Adam to wrap up, but I want to thank all of our panelists for this really interesting conversation. C45 will be posting this meeting online in the next week or so. So if there's anything you missed, you'll be able to review and share it with others. I appreciate you sharing your insight and experience. It's been incredibly valuable. Adam?
Thanks, David. Yeah, I just want closing remarks. Just want to thank, Ben, Patrick, Ashish, Sarah for joining us today and giving us their time to share their feedback and everything. Really great insight to, what has turned from, from COVID in terms of inspections and what we can prepare for the members here today. So thanks everybody, and Karina and David as well for setting this up.
Thank you, everyone. This was great.
All right, thanks everyone. We will see you again very soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye,
Bye now.
everyone.
Okay, thank you.